5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a lift.
Alcohol in Space. That is actually the title of an existing book, written by Chris Carberry, who is also the CEO of Explore Mars. Chris is our guest this week, and we're talking about everything alcohol in space. From the history of alcohol consumption in space, over its effects in microgravity, all the way to what kind of drinks we may produce in space in the future. So in this vein, cheers and enjoy. My name is Raphael Rodkin, and I'm an investor and advisor to space companies. Just as a reminder, this podcast is for informational purposes only, and nothing should be taken as investment advice. This podcast is sponsored by Nano Avionics, a satellite manufacturer and mission integrator. Their technologies enable many space companies worldwide to offer services that improve life right here on Earth, such as providing global connectivity, conducting Earth observation, or contributing to scientific discoveries. Check them out, and also check out my episode with the CEO and co-founder. Sadly, I am not a rocket scientist, but I'm an alumnus of the International Space University. ISU offers a number of educational programs about space worldwide. Check them out at isunet.edu. And just some final things before we start the episode about ourselves. If you enjoy the podcast, please leave us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platforms such as Apple or Spotify. If you want us help expand our work, you can do so and support us at www.patreon.com/Space Business Podcast, and we'll also put that link in the episode notes. And lastly, you can follow us on Twitter at podcast_space. Hey, space enthusiasts, welcome back to another episode. It is one of our non-business episodes. If you glanced at the title, that is pretty clear. It's about alcohol in space. Although, of course, I think there could be quite an interesting business angle to that, and maybe we'll talk about this during this episode as well. But I welcome my guest, who is an expert. He has literally written a book on the subject, Chris Carberry. Welcome, Chris.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Chris, could you just briefly introduce yourself and how you got to write a book on alcohol in space?
Well, my day job is being CEO of the US-based nonprofit Explore Mars. But before that, I was executive director of the Mars Society and worked with a lot of other space groups. And during all these events, would go to events, go to bars or something after events, and sometimes have silly conversations on what would wine tastes like if you manufactured it on Mars, or could you brew beer in space, etc. And I thought it might be great or kind of cool to write a semi-serious article on the topic. But as the years went by, I realized as I started looking at more and more companies that were investing in space-related alcohol technologies, there was enough out there for an entire book. So that's how I kind of got into it. As I was looking at this large number of alcohol companies, as well as the interesting history of drinking in space as well as how it's been dealt with through science fiction. So I realized it would probably be a great book, and I might as well be the first one.
That makes all the sense to me in the world. I mean, alcohol has been part of human culture for probably many thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. And we'll talk about the history. By the way, I felt obligated to have this episode over a drink. I know that's unfair to you because it's 10 a.m. for you. Myself, I'm in Europe, so it's 4 p.m. And so I'm enjoying a nice glass of Alsatian Gewürztraminer. There you go.
Cheers.
Depending on how long we talk, we can switch drinks. But did you actually get an answer to some of these questions you mentioned? Like, what would wine taste like in space? And then I guess that is a segue into my next question right after that, when we talk about history. Well, I'm going to ask you a similar question that I asked for our most recent episode, which was on sex in space. And I asked, well, has there been sex in space? And the answer was like, well, the official line is no. And I'm going to ask you, well, has there been alcohol consumption in space?
Well, I can answer all of those, but what do you want me to answer first?
Well, why don't we go straight into the history? Has there been, and I actually know the answer, but just for you to elaborate a little bit, has there been alcoholic consumption in space? And what are some famous known examples?
Yeah, no, there's been drinking in space practically from the beginning of human spaceflight. At first, people would smuggle it up just as a gag, but pretty early on, people were consuming alcohol. Perhaps the most famous example was actually for religious service. Buzz Aldrin consumed wine on the surface of the moon as part of a communion prayer for his church. So he brought up a goblet and communion wine and actually consumed it and just said a prayer. Now, he had hoped to make this part of his public statement as he was talking to Earth, his opening statements, but he was told by NASA, you probably should hold off until we're not on the air anymore, because they were very nervous on the reaction. Just a few months earlier, they had received a lot of blowback from an atheist group when Apollo 8 had basically recited from the book of Genesis in their orbiting around the moon around Christmas that year in 1968. And so they were really worried if, Buzz Aldrin were saying a prayer and drinking on the surface of the moon, what sort of blowback that would have. So he had to say that off the record, but they still have that goblet that was brought up, supplied to him by the Webster Presbyterian Church near Houston. They still have an annual mass at that church honoring the moon communion prayer on the back in 1969.
But that's interesting. It sounds to me from the way you described it that it may have been more the NASA concern may have been more about appearing non-sectarian than about necessarily appearing sober.
Well, even at the time, alcohol wasn't officially prohibited in space at the time. Currently, it's prohibited by every country that's going into space, some of which more strictly than others, as I will get into. Yeah, they were concerned about what people would think at Buzz or drinking on the surface of the moon, but it probably was more of the religion aspect to it. But over time, later, just a few years later, when they were planning for the Skylab missions, wine was going to be part of the menu because they wanted Skylab to be home away from home. And so they even hired an expert to look at what would be the most stable wine that could go through all the shaking of being launched into space in these extreme environments. And they picked the sherry, but before they launched, it got leaked to the press. And so they got nervous and they canceled the wine from the Skylab missions. But ever since then, pretty much around that time, alcohol has officially been prohibited. But that doesn't mean it's not happening. Alcohol has been smuggled up to ISS and the Mir space station and other places for many years, and primarily to the Russians. They will, slip them in their spacesuits. There's this famous time period when there's a perfect time to put, smugglables, in their spacesuits. Back in, when Yuri Gagarin flew, obviously that was a successful mission. The Russians became very superstitious about following the path of Yuri Gagarin before every flight, and they still do. Most famously, Yuri Gagarin on the bus trip over to the launch pad had to relieve himself, had to urinate, and they stopped the bus halfway to the launch pad. And he got out, unzipped his spacesuit, and basically urinated on the back tire of the bus. Now, every mission going off from Russia do that also. They stop, and the crew will get off, unzip their spacesuits. Their spacesuits who have already been pressurized and sealed up, and urinate or pretend to on the back bus, back wheel of the bus. But it's all to the time people will put in certain things they want to smuggle up to ISS, including alcohol. So many crews have consumed alcohol, primarily cognac. They consider that's kind of the official drink of space right now. And they don't drink a huge amount, but crews often will have little toasts. When a new crew comes up, they'll have a reception, or other times when it's been a really intense day. So it's used as a great way to build camaraderie between international crew members, often when there's a lot of tension between the countries. And this is an interesting thing. People don't understand how important this role of building up that camaraderie in space is. The international partners that include Russia are still able to get along in space, even though often the relationships have been pretty rocky here on Earth. So I think alcohol has actually helped in that process.
So that's very interesting to hear. And by the way, I wasn't aware of the cognac. I mean, that sounds to me, we'll talk about the business part of it. It sounds to me like a company like Honesty from France should be all over it and exploiting it, and maybe they have been. But I also wasn't aware of the Skylab history, but then you're saying, okay, it happened on Mir International Space Station. So did we ever get some answer to this taste question that you brought up at the beginning, that whether alcohol tastes different than it does taste on Earth?
Well, everything tastes different in space, actually, at least in microgravity. This is one of the big challenges for the alcohol producers interested in, sending their product up into space, because most astronauts feel as though they have a head cold, kind of the fluid shift. And so their taste buds are affected, so they don't taste as well in space. So most astronauts usually like to have a lot of hot sauce up in space to add a little more taste to their food. And so obviously this is going to impact alcohol taste. One of the problems, like for instance, and that's not the only problem. Also, for anything carbonated in space, that's a problem as well. As you probably know, anybody who's looked at a carbonated drink on the surface of Earth in 1G, all the gas bubbles rise to the surface and disperse into the atmosphere. That doesn't happen in space. Because there's no gravity, it all goes to the center in a ball and starts expanding. And it does that in your stomach as well. And so astronauts that have consumed carbonated beverages have reported stomach cramps and wet burps, which isn't exactly the sort of reaction most people want their products to have in space. So a lot of companies are looking at this. As a beer company currently in Australia, which is a collaboration of a aerospace company and a brewery. Aerospace company is Sabre Astronautics. The brewery is Four Pines Brewery, who came up with Vostok beer, named after Yuri Gagarin's flight. And what they've been trying to do with that is create a beer that was consumable in space. So it had strong enough taste, but also didn't have as much carbonation as at least American beers would have. And so what they picked was a stout with lower carbonation, kind of like a British beer, actually, and it tested on zero-G flights. That's only just a few minutes at a time or a few seconds at a time, but they hope to be able to send it up into space and have people consume beer. There's also a French company, Maison Môme, champagne company, who has been very enthusiastic and have been creating a special champagne bottle and champagne to send up to microgravity because they want to provide the champagne for people going up into space hotels. And they've tested it on multiple zero-gravity flights, parabolic flights and airplanes, but they're also sending their space champagne bottle up into space on SpaceX with the Axiom 3 flight this fall. So there's a lot of companies looking at this and trying to offset these problems to see if they can figure out, particularly the carbonated beverages, how they can overcome these problems. But taste, once again, is impacted. So as people are developing alcohol that's going to be suitable for consumption, at least in microgravity, they have to think about that because it won't taste exactly the same as it does here on the surface of Earth.
So the people who are going on Axiom 3, all of which, at least the customers will have paid a very substantial amount of money to have an enjoyable experience. I mean, to the best of your knowledge, will they be allowed to taste the champagne in space, or does that still fall under those rules you mentioned?
I don't believe anybody's going to be tasting this, but with the advent of commercial space, more and more of these private players, it's inevitable. Axiom with their space station plans have planned for bars in space. Back at the first all-private mission, I'm blanking right now, and one of my former board members was on the mission back a couple of years ago in September. They were thinking about having a toast, but since the mission was to help support St. Jude's Research Hospital, they thought since it was trying to raise money for children's cancer research, maybe they didn't want to distract everybody with drinking alcohol in space. So it's inevitable. And I don't think anybody's going to be consuming any of the champagne in the next mission. But this is inevitable. Now that you're having private missions and you don't have all the rules that NASA and other space agencies have, people, when they're spending, as you mentioned, millions of dollars to go into space, they're going to want to drink.
And so the official line you're saying is if you're on any sort of government-connected mission in any country right now, so I guess the human spaceflight countries, basically Russia, United States, China, and then sort of emerging India, Japan, it's prohibited everywhere.
I'm not sure about China. I suspect it is in China as well, but certainly everybody included in the International Space Station partnership, it's officially prohibited. But some countries, it's more like, we're not supposed to drink, wink, wink. And so, Russia, it's less stringent. They consider it actually, frankly, healthy for the astronauts to be, our cosmonauts to be drinking in space to relieve some of the stress. France, it's always been an area of contention as well, since it's such a strong part of French culture. And so pretty much the U.S. has really leveraged the other partners to make sure that this is prohibited in space, officially.
Yes. But coming back to sort of the example you mentioned of Buzz Aldrin celebrating Mass by himself on the lunar surface, and then, as you do in a traditional Mass, having some some wine. Do you know that, like, let's say if you were a very observant, if it was part of your religion and you were an observant astronaut, like let's say you're Jewish and you want to celebrate a proper Shabbat, like they would not allow you. They would still say, sorry, like we know it's part of your religion, but you can't.
Yeah, no, yes. That's what they would say. Whether they actually, once again, whether they really strictly enforce that, I don't know. That's a good question. I did not cover whether any religious, other than Buzz, whether there has been any alcohol consumed in space beyond that was related to religious ceremony. Probably has, but I don't know. But I don't know that for sure.
And so I suppose, stating probably the obvious, the reason people don't want, or the space agencies don't want or don't encourage the drinking, other than maybe the Russians to some extent, as you mentioned, is because it's a depressant, it's known to impair judgment. I guess it's also a flammable substance. I assume those are it's for all of the standard reasons.
It's pretty much. Now, you'll get a couple answers. Obviously, you don't want your astronauts being inebriated in space. And that makes sense. I agree with that. We don't want our astronauts being inebriated in space. The other reason that they usually point to, though, isn't that. It's actually that the alcohol, the fumes can impact the environmental control system. Basically it'll gunk up the filters or something like that. I don't know how much of that is valid. I think it's probably partially true. But once again, people have been drinking in space for decades and it hasn't created big problems. And the amount of alcohol they've consumed has been so little. I have not heard of anybody getting inebriated in space. And a lot of people I've spoken to, astronauts, and some astronauts that I would consider very, very, I wouldn't say conservative, but I would have thought that they would be opposed to alcohol in space, but they're not, because they mentioned as long as you manage it, in some cases, sleep medications that are approved for astronauts can have a much larger impact on human physiology than the small amount of alcohol people have been drinking. And so I think we all know that there are many sleep medications that can have a dramatically different impact on different people, depending on their body mass and other physiological aspects, which vary from person to person. I know a friend of mine who works as a professional in space medicine, and she's a physician. And before a flight, she took one of them. I can't remember one of the main name brand sleep medications, and it had a really bad impact to the point where she arrived at her destination. She gave her talk, woke up the next morning, didn't recall any of it. She'd literally gone through the whole day, given a presentation, had basically spoken to dozens of people, and had no recollection from the point that she took sleep medication on the plane.
And so by the way, I guess by virtue and definition of everything we've discussed so far, that to our knowledge, there haven't been any sort of controlled studies about the impact of alcohol in sustained microgravity. But has there been maybe even shorter studies? Do we know anything about how alcohol, how they're saying sometimes, or some people saying, I don't even know whether it's true, that alcohol, if you drink while you're flying on an aircraft, it has sort of a stronger effect on you. Is there something that we have studied with respect to the physiological impact of alcohol in sustained microgravity?
Not officially, not in space, because once again, once you have a study, you're acknowledging there's drinking in space. And so this is a big issue. And I think hopefully now that we have commercial flights going, we can do some of these real studies, because, when you assume people are going to drink in space, it's a valid thing to be able to try to understand human physiology. We know it doesn't kill you, and we know it doesn't have a dramatically different impact, at least for small amounts, because people have been drinking in space for a long time. But we don't have any real studies to show how humans metabolize alcohol in space, except for anecdotal tales. There've been high altitude studies here on Earth, but the high altitude studies here on Earth really, I don't think, are good analogs for space, because it's a completely different environment.
Yeah, fair enough. So when we're talking about the sort of developing commercial space industry, specifically the, whatever you want to call it, space tourism. I know some of the people don't like for it to be called space tourism. They say we're private space explorers, and I sort of sympathize with that as well, depending on the mission. But so in terms of rules, do you know whether that's then let's say if you do what you did with Inspiration 4, right? So you're not even docking at the ISS, right? You're not kind of...
That's it, Inspiration 4. Why I blanked on the name, I don't know.
Yes, exactly. Inspiration 4, led by Jared Isaacman. That's like you mentioned, the mission that was done to benefit St. Jude's Hospital. So that's, a fully private mission in the sense that they're not using any government facilities in space. They're not docking at the ISS.
Well, I said there was no rule against it. I mentioned earlier, I just blanked on the name for some reason. They were considering doing a toast up in space, but decided not to because of St. Jude's. They did, however, bring up, I believe it was 70 pounds of hops, which were then sold to Sam Adams here in the United States to make beer out of.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. Yeah. That is a interesting business as well, what I call like space-derived drinks or something like that. We'll definitely talk about that as well. But so just to confirm, so there's basically, if you're running a private mission, I was just asking because who knows, maybe there would have been some FAA or some other rule that it doesn't matter if it's private, you're still not allowed to do it. But from what you're saying, you would be allowed to drink if it was a fully private mission.
No, I believe so. It's just, right now they're still trying, optics is still a concern. They want to keep this whole momentum going. They don't want to too early in the process, I assume. They don't want to push it too far, particularly when it's really dangerous. Now, when you're up on a SpaceX craft, it's pretty much all automated. There's some human interaction with it, but it's pretty much being run by the computer. So even if you had a little bit to drink, it's not going to impact anything.
I know because my venture fund, we're seed investors in Space Perspective. People don't know this is a company that's doing sort of a space tourism with stratospheric balloons. You don't technically go to space, but you're going to near space. And one of the points they very often mention in their marketing materials is this is a very nice, comfortable sort of lounge style capsule, which has not only an onboard bathroom, but it also has an onboard bar, and which is clearly not something that's present in any other space capsule, at least to my knowledge. But maybe, Chris, have you heard anything about the upcoming space stations, like Axiom Station and things like that? Is anybody thinking about having an onboard bar?
I believe Axiom is planning on having a bar on, at least one of their future ones. I think most of them are thinking of that. Not all, but I believe I recall looking at some of the earlier Axiom designs, and they included bars. And as I said, Axiom partnered with Maison Mum, so they're very interested in this and having champagne up on their space stations. I actually was at the formal announcement of this partnership at the Paris Observatory back in the fall, at IAC. And, you could tell that Axiom was very motivated to be able to enable the sort of research and the ability to have champagne or other drinks in space.
Hey, fellow space enthusiasts. This is just a quick 30-second reminder that I just released my introductory space economy book called To Infinity in English. It provides a non-technical introduction to the space sector, covering key trends, key space businesses, humanity's potential future in space, and how you can get involved. All of this is based on my daily experience as a space venture investor and also as a university lecturer on space entrepreneurship. The book is about 250 pages long, and you can get the Kindle version for about $10. You can find it on Amazon, or you can download a free sample at spacebusiness.substack.com. The link is also in the episode notes. Now back to today's episode. Besides Maison Mum and you mentioned one of the American beer companies, I forget which one. What have there been other sort of interesting examples of? It's obviously the liquor industry is a very big industry on Earth. Have there been other interesting examples, anecdotes you want to mention of terrestrial liquor companies getting interested in space and doing interesting things?
Oh, there are a lot of them. One of the most well-known ones is Ardbeg, the Scottish whiskey company. They sent up the first whiskey aging experiment in space back in 2011, came back down in 2014. And so they had a ground sample, a test sample that remained here on Earth, and then the other samples in space. And now they had to it wasn't like they sent barrels up into space. They had these little test mix sticks, basically with shavings of the oak barrels, and were able to see how it aged in space. Now, they only had 2 weeks to plan for this because they were given the opportunity, but only 2 weeks to be able to put this plan together. So it was probably flawed, but it got them a lot of PR. And the space-flown samples tasted quite a bit different and not for the better. Some of the reports said it had a kind of rubbery, fishy taste to it, which are not the qualities you usually like in Scotch. But that's probably because of the handling. They only had 2 weeks to plan. It stayed up in space for a lot longer than it was intended to because there was a problem with the SpaceX launch in between. And they probably didn't have time to take into account all the extreme shaking and other extreme environments it would have to go through. So hopefully hopefully Ardbeg will be able to send up another mission. But Suntory, the Japanese whiskey company, also sent up 2 whiskey aging experiments, one of which is still up there, but they've been very close-lipped about the results. So they were trying to see if aging and microgravity actually mellowed the product more than being here on Earth. So it'll be interesting to see if Suntory comes back with a report at some point. But after just as the book was being published, a group in France sent up 12 bottles of Bordeaux to see how Bordeaux or wine would age in space as well. Apparently there was a difference. There was quite a bit of a difference between the terrestrial wine and the wine that was aged in space. I mean, not tremendous, but it was definitely a difference. So a lot of companies are looking at that aspect, whether they can actually benefit from the space environment, by aging, or even, for instance, a company like Anheuser-Busch here in the United States sent up 4 barley experiments to ISS, trying to see, what the impact of, whether they could grow barley in space, what would be the impact on the barley, and whether they could use that space environment to create something completely unique in their beer production. Because they announced back in 2017 they wanted to be the first beer manufacturer on Mars. They kind of dropped that goal now, but they still conducted these very important experiments. And that's not just important for beer in space or whiskey in space. When companies like Anheuser-Busch invest in barley in space, that's investing in space agriculture, which is one of the most important technologies, innovations required for sustainability in space.
Yes, absolutely. And by the way, just to add on one thing you were saying, that the French company with the Bordeaux, that was Space Cargo Unlimited. Their founder, Nicolas Gaume, he was on an earlier episode of this podcast, not specifically talking about wine, but yes. So that was very interesting. Of course, the other interesting aspect there is, and I don't know to what extent the other companies try to replicate that. Nicolas, certainly his plan was to then auction off some of these bottles for quite substantial amounts of money.
Yeah, one of them, I believe, for $1 million.
Yep,
these were already high-priced bottles. I mean, I think the bottles before they went into space were each bottle worth $5,000 or $6,000. So they weren't inexpensive bottles of Bordeaux in the first place, but now that they've been in space, there are actually a lot of companies and people I've been talking to who want to take advantage of that because they see this as an advantage, an opportunity, to try to manufacture alcohol in space to really grab that high-end alcohol market. So how many times, if you have the first whiskey or moonshine produced on the moon, how much would somebody here on Earth pay for that? And so there are a number of companies right now who are actually trying to get into that business model, see if they can actually make money on the high-end alcohol production market where they sell very rare space-produced or space-flown alcohol, for $1 million plus.
I mean, so somebody really has got to do moonshine on the moon. I mean, that's just too obvious.
Well, and that's one of the guy who's talking about it wants to do just that, produce moonshine on the moon. So besides Nicolas' very highly priced auctioned bottles of Bordeaux, to your knowledge, is there, if one of us just wanted to buy some sort of space produced alcohol, are we actually able to do that? Space produced, there have not been anybody, as far as I know, that we've, sold. I mean, we've produced alcohol based on ingredients that are in the space, like barley or yeast or hops.
Yeah, sorry, that's what I thought. Let's call it space connected. Like maybe the ingredients went to space or the finished product went to space, like with the Bordeaux.
Yeah,
space connected.
There have been other bottles that have been in space that have been auctioned. That case, during Apollo 11, there were 3 bottles of not sherry, but of alcohol. I'm just blanking on. I should have reviewed my own book before doing the call. It was auctioned, little mini bottles, and one of them was auctioned by Jim Lovell. I believe it was $17,000 several years ago. Yeah, which actually not a bad price. You got, the bottle, one of, 3 bottles to go around the moon, plus a, certificate of authenticity signed by Jim Lovell.
So coming now though to actually space-produced alcohol, because I guess the implicit question there is like, if everything goes well and we start settling places like the moon or even further away like Mars, right? It probably beyond a certain point, it's obviously not going to be very efficient to just bring along alcohol from Earth. Yeah, what are the thoughts of locally producing alcohol?
Yeah, no, that's important. If once we have sustainability in space, people want to have, bars or something in space or have just regular alcohol when they're living in various space environments, it won't be practical to send it all from Earth. So they'll have to figure out whether they can manufacture it in space. And one of the most important things there is agriculture. So they have to figure out how to produce plants to such an extent, sufficiently to be able to not only generate enough food to eat, but be able to justify actually using some of that biomass to create alcohol. And so it's all connected. And so, but in space, we might actually use feed products that we don't here on Earth. We only use a small number of them here on Earth because they work very well, whether it be barley or rice or sugarcane or potatoes, etc. But we can use any number of types of biomass, pretty much anything you can extract sugar from. So you might want to use things that we would not be eating, like the waste product, algae, things like that. And with that, they might actually be able to create entirely new classes of alcohol using different feedstock, but also when you mix that into the entirely different environment. So how is alcohol going to be produced in different gravity? Will fermentation and distillation work the same way or in 1/3 gravity of Mars? Will it taste different? Will it also absorb some of the, say, terroir or Marswar on Mars? The certain taste, whether it be of the soil indigenous to Mars or just the environment that it's being manufactured in. So a lot of different factors, and atmospheric pressure as well. When you put these all together, you might create entirely new classes of alcohol that could only be produced on Mars or only produced on the moon or only produced in microgravity. And think about how much those will be sold for on Earth.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me because for the little I know about sort of the history on Earth, it seems like people around the Earth are basically have come up with alcohol and just, so to say, they fermented whatever they found they could ferment. So it seems like we would do the same thing in space.
Oh, yeah. They get by it in prisons, say, on Biosphere 2, the original crew on Biosphere 2, also, they didn't have any alcohol, so they actually did some experiment and eventually made some banana wine. Apparently it tastes like crap, but it still was satisfying to be able to make your own wine in Biosphere 2.
It seems there's really some interesting room for creativity and maybe even for people like synthetic biologists who get involved in all of this in space.
Well, and I certainly spoke to a lot of synthetic biologists about this as well. And so you never know, as all these processes are developing, may not having the feedstock or the alcohol may not be as big a problem as you may think, depending on if you're using synthetic biology. And, they might be able to solve all these issues, meaning over time, we may not have a problem feeding the crew or having enough feedstock or whatever indigenous alcohol they may want to produce. And I apologize. I've been very raspy during this interview.
No worries. And I guess there's sort of, I don't know, maybe I'm just going off the rails here. There's some sort of interesting angle here as well in terms of justifying this, that, some of the produced, especially if we do something like ethanol, you'd basically use it as a propellant as well.
Well, that is true. There are multiple uses for alcohol. You don't just drink it. So, when you think about it in these terms, how can you use this? Provide some responsible way of consuming alcohol, but, use this also to justify that you need to be able to perfect this process for other systems as well. And so, I think there are plenty of reasons why you can justify the manufacturing of alcohol in space and not just to get, not just for consumption.
So it seems like now is really, given the state of development of the commercial space sector, and again, specifically the space tourism industry, it seems like it's the right time to start thinking about all of this in more seriousness, like the regulatory angle and the consumption angle, the production angle. From where we stand today and with your knowledge, which is probably more than anyone else on this topic, where do you see the sort of near and medium-term future for alcohol in space? What are some of the interesting aspects you're watching?
Well, I think once again, it's all very much connected to this commercial space industry, as we have more companies like Axiom and others paying for completely private missions. And as we really start building private space stations, this will be part of it because they are building it into it. And that's why Maison Mom specifically and the Vostok beer and others have been trying to create space-specific products to be able to really take advantage of this new environment. Oh, obviously, they want to make money on it directly, but also being able to use that as marketing as well. for instance, the exclusive champagne producer for, for instance, the Axiom space station of the future. That would be quite an accolade for Maison Mum. And they'd be able to make a lot more money here on Earth because of just that accomplishment. And so I think this is going to grow. I think more and more companies are looking at this. It's still not inexpensive, but we're trying to bring more and more of the players together to look at all the problems, the physiological issues, the challenges, the ethical issues, and responsible ways to be able to advance this. So, and looking at some historical examples, like, for instance, in my book, I mentioned the example of, whereas the U.S. Navy has it's almost completely, it's not completely prohibition, but almost. Whereas the French Navy, not surprisingly, they will have bars on their ship, but they restrict it they have a very effective way of restricting it, 1 drink per day, and they keep track of it. And this could be done in space as well to monitor alcohol consumption, much more closely than people do here on Earth. So I think there are responsible ways of doing it. And I think it's actually when you're going to be away from Earth for so long, living in a foreign environment, completely alien, so to speak, from living here on Earth, these little parts of Earth, these ways of relieving the tension, building up camaraderie, having ceremonies are very important. And I think a lot of the manufacturers here on Earth, not just alcohol producers, but others are beginning to see this. And that's why a lot of them investing in space-related projects.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought up the example of the navies there. I guess this is another parallel to our recent episode on sex in space. There we started talking about submarines, right? Submarines as an example of an extremely confined, life-threatening environment on Earth. And I guess it'd be interesting to see and look what the rules are on various nations' submarines with regard to alcohol consumption.
I can't tell you what all the different rules are on submarines around the world. It would be an interesting area of study because, they're very similar to space, but it's, obviously a much more dangerous environment as well than surface ship. So that would be an interesting area to look at each country and how they deal with that. Because obviously on surface ships, it's much more straightforward, but still complex. But, submarines are very, very dangerous, even the best of circumstances. And so who knows?
Yeah. It's like surface ship, like, you go off the rails then. I mean, maybe literally you go off the rails, but you don't sort of endanger the entire vessel, right? Whereas a submarine, if somebody goes off the rails, it might be very dangerous. That's, I think, where the comparison came from. But I just realized speaking of space tourism, I totally forgot to ask you, have you heard anything about, so we've been talking orbital space tourism and for good reason, right? But on those suborbital flights, if somebody just wanted to on the sort of like the highest point of a New Shepard mission, just have a quick toast, I assume that would theoretically be allowed, or have you heard anything about that?
It's possible, and I've heard a number of people talking about it. It hasn't happened to my knowledge. I'm trying to think back if I'm wrong. I don't think I recall seeing anybody doing it, but I've certainly spoken to a number of people on that. And so I think that's fairly inevitable as well. They just have to also understand they'll have to clean up the space capsule quite a bit after. Since it's hard to maintain, keep track of, champagne at least is going to go all over the place if you open it up in that environment. And that's one of the things that Maison Mum also created. They created a special bottle to prevent it from spraying everywhere. They have a little lid over the top to prevent it spraying, and so they can control it coming out of the bottle.
Yeah, no, I guess you need a special type of glass as well, right, to drink it in microgravity, which is yet another opportunity. Something like a brands like Baccarat or somebody could get involved.
Yeah, no, well, Maison Mum also created a special glass so that people can drink their product appropriately. They want to enhance the, quote, conviviality of drinking in space. But there are also several companies that have been looking at microgravity glassware. I don't have it in front of me right now, but a microgravity cocktail glass. And a company's created a microgravity scotch glass as well. Basically you fill it from the bottom and use little grooves. So the liquid comes up to the groove so you can still drink it like you drink, a beverage here on Earth, except it's not filled to the top. It's just using the physics, the fluid physics, come up the surface on the sides, and then you sip it that way.
So that's the sort of the stemware, so to say, and producing space-related drinks. I mean, since this is a space business podcast, any other sort of like alcohol and space-related business opportunities that spring to your mind?
Well, I think, there should be actually, like, for instance, distillation in space. Say, obviously, it comes with some issues, flames and everything in space. But that would be useful for many industries. So pharmaceuticals, other industry, partnering with alcohol companies to figure out if you can do this, so there's cross-pollination. As I mentioned, it's great when you can find companies that are investing where there's crossover technology. This is one of my favorite aspects. Like the Budweiser, Anheuser-Busch example, they were investing in space agriculture. Well, cocktail glasses like that, they're also investing in fluid dynamics that are important for other systems as well. What can you find that, you have overlapping technologies for space, but also here on Earth as well? So I think there are a lot of those coming up soon. As I mentioned, the agriculture aspects are very obvious. And the more companies that are looking at that, whether they're alcohol-based food production, agriculture, very important. So if we can find more ways to find private investment in these critical technologies that have many overlapping needs or products like food, but even for food agriculture, you have many products beyond food, not just alcohol. You can manufacture things, with agricultural products. And so it's when you can find these overlaps. And I think there are also, and this is why there are venture capitalists now investing in Mars-related technology, because they realize you're not investing in the entire mission, whereas it's probably not going to make a profit anytime soon if you're paying for a Mars mission. But all these innovations required for sustainability in space could have a direct impact for quality of life here on Earth and create markets here on Earth. And so that's what I'm really interested in with these alcohol in space and a lot of other products, finding these overlaps, for sustainability in space, but also creating markets here on Earth.
I 100% agree with you there. You sometimes call it the other dual use, right? Not dual use civil military, but dual use sort of like use in space, but also use in Earth. And we've invested, for example, in a French company, Interstellar Lab, which you might know, which are doing very advanced greenhouses, which you could ultimately use on Mars, but you can use them on Earth in the meantime. But Chris, as we're winding down here on the episode, just want to ask you a couple of closing questions. By the way, what is your favorite drink?
I'm kind of in between, kind of a big, bold red wine or scotch. Right. Interestingly, and with Ardbeg, kind of funny because I like big, smoky, peaty whiskeys, and Ardbeg was my favorite whiskey before I had any idea that they had any space connection. It was just happy coincidence.
Yeah. And I guess sort of a related question is, so if everything goes well, right, and humanity goes and settles in places like the moon and Mars and so forth, I at least, I don't know what you think, but I think then we would need to come up with drinks which are sort of somehow connected to those places, right? Like on Earth, we have drinks which are connected to places, right? Like I'm partly Brazilian, and like Brazil is like caipirinha, right? As an example, right? Do you have any ideas for like moon drink? I guess we all talked about moonshine. That's kind of funny, but any other ideas for like moon or Mars related drinks which could be candidates for those locations?
You mean for, location related rather than what you're using to make it?
Yes.
Yeah, I've always thought it would be kind of cool to have a drink called Olympus Mons, something based on the volcano, something smoky and bold, cocktail. I think, there are many geological features on Mars, which I think lend themselves to drink names. And so I think you could have a lot of fun with that. And we've been trying on and off to launch this new organization called the Space Drinks Association to bring all the different players together. And that was one of the things we wanted to do, just something fun, have a drink naming competition, for something space related, but something that people actually want to drink rather than just some cutesy drink that happens to have Mars in the title.
Yeah, for sure. And that sounds like a good idea. And I'm certainly on board with that if you guys are going to go ahead with the Space Drinks Association. So final question in our podcast is always about science fiction and usually, what some of your favorite science fiction is, whether it's books or TV shows or movies. But because of the topic, it'd be fun also if you can think of examples to tie it back, of course, to drinking and alcohol in science fiction works.
Well, of course, if anybody who watches science fiction knows that alcohol isn't exactly rare in science fiction. And so whether it's television or film, Star Trek, even on Next Generation, they have synthahol, but they're often drowning real drinks as well. You have Romulan ale and all that. So a lot of alcohol, particularly in the newer Star Treks. Star Wars, of course, Cantina Bar, the Battlestar Galactica, there was actually quite a bit of consumption of alcohol there. Even things like in literature, whether it be Jules Verne, in his lunar mission, they were bringing grapevines to grow on the moon, in Martian Chronicles, there was wine in that as well. So most of them, most of the famous science fiction feature alcohol, or at least the desire to have some alcohol if they didn't have it in the first place in space, because it's really just part of human culture. We've been consuming alcohol and manufacturing it since before written records were, started. And so it's not exactly going to disappear the moment we go into space. And frankly, that ship has sailed because we've been drinking, for decades in space. And so I think this is something that just science fiction writers assume is going to happen. And so it's not some far out idea. They just know it's part of human culture. Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, it has been part of human culture since the beginning, and it's not going to stop anytime soon.
So, by the way, on the science fiction, you mentioned Star Trek. Do we have any idea what Klingon blood wine is?
Well, I'm assuming blood is a portion of it. However, did they create the alcoholic product out of the blood itself? Did they create, extract the sugars from the blood and create alcohol from whatever it's made out of? I don't know. Did they ever mention what kind of blood it is?
That's why I'm asking. I mean, they clearly consume it all of the time and in copious quantities, but I don't think, I'm a huge Star Trek fan and watch it. I don't think they ever actually explain it, but it's an interesting one.
There's probably some really enthusiastic Star Trek fans who will email us and tell us, of course, it's made out of this.
It might be another business opportunity to come up with the blood wine on Earth, probably paying some royalties to the Roddenberrys.
Absolutely.
Chris, thank you so much. We'll be watching this field. As you gather, I'm also, by virtue of this episode and the recent episode on sex in space, I very strongly believe anything that's a strong part of human culture, if we want to go to space, we have to extend it into space. So thank you very much for writing your book. And again, we'll link to your book in the episode notes, and we'll be watching this segment of space.
All right, thank you. And I hope people will also watch out. There'll be a documentary version of Alcohol in Space coming out this fall. So hopefully it'll be on streaming services sometime late this year, early next year.
Terrific. Chris, thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me.
Well, that's it for another nominal episode of the Space Business Podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider giving it a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, such as iTunes. You can follow us on Twitter at podcast_space. Also consider supporting us at www.patreon.com/Space Business Podcast. If the podcast got you interested in learning more about the business opportunities in the space economy, check out my new online course on space entrepreneurship on udemy.com. The link is in the episode description. Lastly, if you have any feedback, including ideas for guests, and that may include yourself if you have an exciting space story to tell, or interested in being a sponsor, drop us an email at spacebusinesspodcast@gmail.com. I look forward to seeing you for the next episode.